I'm Jamal Watkins, Senior Vice President of Strategy and Advancement at the NAACP. And I believe, Eduardo, you are on and we're going to get started.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. I am Eduardo Sainz. I'm the National Field Director for Mi Familia Vota. It's such a pleasure to be here today with every single one of you all. So we're going to talk about redistricting and understand the intersections of the Voting Rights Act. So we know that we want to make sure that we center, there's a couple of individuals that have been at the forefront with redistricting, and we also have a lot of work from now until 2022. There will be a couple of items that we're going to be talking today: the minority vote dilution, the federal protection from the 1965 Voting Rights Act, also the focus on ongoing efforts from communities of interest, and also community organizations like Mi Familia Vota and the NAACP.
Dive into how all of this adds up and really unpack a concept called minority vote dilution. And when we think about how maps are drawn in districts, we know that in many ways there's a lot of ways to draw different maps, if you will, based upon populations. So if you were to imagine in a community you had 50 people, 60% of them were orange, 40% purple. I know that's a little bit cheesy in terms of colors, but think people, and if you were to draw a map, really, dividing up those people, into different segments, there's ways that you can draw maps that are proportionate, meaning it's pretty much fair, if you will. And you could have, 3 orange groupings, 2 purple groupings. You also could have it where it's a hybrid in sort of this proportionality where you have 3 orange and 2 purple groupings, but you mix up the people, if you will, and group them in different ways. But on the sort of other end of the spectrum, there's ways to draw maps where it's not fair, where you have, in one example here, you draw maps where the majority of the groupings benefit one community, say the orange folks, or you do it in a way where it's disproportionate and the majority of the groupings benefit, say, the purple folks, the purple people. And when we start to think about maps, and as Martha was talking about being in this Venn diagram, we're really centering ourselves with identifying what does it mean to draw maps that are fair or equitable or inclusive. And that brings us to the notion of the intentionality of drawing maps. And in communities of color, we have seen historically practices commonly known as packing and cracking that actually occur to dilute the voting strength of a particular community. And in this case, it would be communities of color. Redistricting has been used at times to prevent minority voters from gaining political power by drawing districts in ways that have resulted in voters having less of a chance of electing their candidates of choice. In fact, when you look at districts are usually drawn based upon the cohesion of like-minded groups, if you will. Not necessarily the shapes of the districts matter so much as, how do you allow for folks who live in a certain geography to have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice? And in the cases of minority vote dilution, what you see is that drawers use techniques such as packing and cracking to actually dilute the ability of these communities to be able to pick a candidate of their choice. And so I want to unpack a little bit around packing. And when you think about the term packing, it's a term used when minority voters are compressed into smaller numbers of districts to really, waste or diminish their collective strength instead of effectively controlling one district or more. And an example, listed here, and we're going to make sure you all get this content. Imagine, if you will, there was some blue wards and some gray wards, 60% blue, 40% gray. Think about the purple people, the orange people. You can draw a map in a way where you can pack one grouping into specific districts so that you literally dilute their ability to have the choice to choose their electorals, if you will. And there's different ways that can play out. And an example of this is when map makers draw one district that is over 90% of a single minority group, when they could draw 2 districts in this model that have 50% of a single minority group. And so it's making choices. And in a real world example, we were on a call with the folks in Atlanta, Georgia, talking redistricting. And they said for Georgia, you see packing happening in the Atlanta metro area because that's where the majority of the population of people of color live. And so one of the strategies has been from folks who are manipulating maps is to pack those communities into districts so that you dilute their ability to have a vote choice, if you will. But then there's the other side, which is called cracking. And it really is this notion of splitting apart the areas of minority voters into thinly into districts known as cracking, splitting or fracturing. And it's the opposite of packing. And there's many ways that this plays out, but it's still that sort of notion that if you're drawing a map and you're manipulating the numbers, you can create it to where you break up the strength of that community by having it, literally cracked apart, if you will. And using Georgia as an example, that same conversation around Atlanta, the folks in the field were saying, now you have this issue of packing in Atlanta, the Atlanta metro area, but outside of Atlanta, you see cracking. So in smaller communities in parts of Georgia, think Albany, Savannah, and even smaller cities, Rome, Augusta, cracking was the strategy because it was meant to dilute, from another perspective, the voting strength of communities of color. And so in one state, you saw trends of packing and cracking happening deliberately to manipulate the vote, if you will. So what's the remedy to this? What's the federal remedy? Are there protections here? I'm curious as to those that are on the Zoom, raise your hand or wave your hand if you are an attorney, an operative, or the Voting Rights Act like the back of your hand. You know it really well. You've played with it. I see some folks waving your hands, Gary and others. So when we get to the part where we do Q&A and discussion, we want you to lean in a little bit more, but I am not a lawyer. And so I'm gonna walk through the Voting Rights Act and throw up some of the framework, but wanna make sure that we ground it in how, the Voting Rights Act being passed at the height of the civil rights movement in 1965 was a way to prevent the systematic and widespread voter discrimination experienced by people of color. Now, some of you may remember Lyndon Baines Johnson. I wasn't around then, but under his watch, the Voting Rights Act was really considered to be one of the single most important federal statutes protecting the right to vote. Now, the act itself contains several important provisions. One of the provisions, Section 5, who we all know was gutted during the Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court decision. That section was a section that really maintained that certain states would have to get pre-approval or pre-clearance before changing things in regards to voting rights in their states. That section is gone, it's gutted. We're looking for a fix, but Section 2 still stands. And Section 2 was really adopted essentially as an enforcement mechanism for the 15th Amendment's guarantee that the right to vote cannot be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And it allowed for voters to seek judicial relief if they believed that a state or local government had denied or limited their voting rights on the basis of base, color, or membership in a language minority group. Very clear, it's a protection. And when you think about Section 2, there's case law that shows how it got even further nuanced and developed. It was amended in 1982, and it really lifted up, the requirements that the results in the abridgment of the right to vote on account of a voter's race, color, or language minority status was unlawful, whether the intent to discriminate could be proven or not. So if there was an unintended racialized outcome or an intended racialized outcome, Section 2 applies. That's a win. That's a victory in sort of augmenting the law. We also saw further revisions to the statute that whether a discriminatory result had occurred requires the totality of circumstances to determine whether or not the challenged voting restriction actually abridged protected voters' ability to participate equally in elections and to elect a representative of their choice. That's a lot, that's a mouthful. But that notion of totality of circumstances was also amended into the statute to further develop it. But at the end of the day, Section 2 has really given rise to two types of cases, one around vote dilution and one around vote deprivation claims. But in terms of vote dilution, it literally is the thing that we're focusing in on that gives us some protection from things like packing and cracking as it relates to the drawing of maps through the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to lift up a few more nuances in that, we really want to be crystal clear that there's case law that has made this section stronger. In 1986, Thornburg versus Gingles established that affected minority groups, literally are sufficiently large to elect a representative of its choice, that the minority group is politically cohesive, and that the white majority voters vote sufficiently as a bloc to usually defeat the minority group's preferred candidates, allowed for a clarifying, if you will, of the test for vote dilution as a claim. And then in subsequent cases, there was even more nuances that allowed for, this statute to really be strong in terms of the extent of the law. And so as we think about the conclusion of at least Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, I know you all can read this on your own, and you'll get this as a textual aid. And folks like Gary, you don't need it because you know it, but the criteria for majority minority districts protected under Section 2 of the VRA is designed to ensure people are in districts that literally give them a fair chance of electing candidates of their choice. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act literally protects certain criteria for drawing majority minority districts. This includes that the minority group is sufficiently large and geographically concentrated to make up a majority district. It includes that the minority group is politically cohesive. This means that the individuals that make up the group vote in a similar pattern, e.g. that they usually vote for the same candidates. It also includes that the white majority usually votes together to defeat the minority preferred candidates. That's a qualifier. And it includes, given the totality of circumstances listed above, that the minority group has less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the electoral process and to elect representatives of its choice. It's really this notion of equity, if you will, as a standard when drawing maps. Other types of districts include minority coalition districts, crossover districts, and influence districts. Now, if your eyes are glazing over and you're saying, Jamal, this is a lot, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know what to do, there is hope out there in the world in that many of our organizations have legal teams, general counsel, in-house lawyers, and then there are partner organizations that do this work in a deeper way so that if we have to get into the weeds and the nuances, we can. But for the most part, the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, provides a vehicle, if you will, for protections as it relates to deliberate packing and cracking and the sort of racialized gerrymandering, if you will, of maps. Again, remember, back to what Martha lifted up, we're in this Venn diagram and we live in the nexus of many maps. There are folks who are literally drawing maps, some with good intentions, some with not. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Eduardo to talk through an example of a congressional district in Arizona that sort of lifts up the notion of a majority minority district. Eduardo?
Yes, thank you so much, Jamal, for the presentation. And again, it's so wonderful to be here with all of you all. So we wanted to talk about the Arizona Congressional District 3. So we'll go into the next slide. And Arizona Congressional District covers the southern part of our wonderful state of Arizona, has a very diverse community, has a an average population of Latinos around 30%, has representation on native land. It also has representation on Black and white communities. So Arizona 3rd Congressional District is a district that contains, again, the southern border and shares border with California and also close border with our wonderful neighbors with Texas. Much of their district population is within the western part of Tucson, which is the second largest city in the state. And it's currently represented by Congressman Raul Grijalva. So again, on the right, we can see the population, close to 700,000 individuals, gender, close to a close split in the different population of race, unemployment, the medium household income, etc. So we'll go into the next slide. And in order to ensure that we have maps like this one, we want to make sure that there is a fair objectives. We want to ensure that there's that we draw these equitable and inclusive maps that ensure that voters of color have an opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, which includes the Latino community, natives, African Americans, the Asian Pacific and Islander, etc. We want to make sure that there's the change of rules where possible. We also can defend the rules that were necessary through sometimes we have to do litigation and do advocate and ignite to shape the debate, create a political demand and push the right for narrative. And in order also another point to create the fair maps is to have a fair count with the census, like the one that we just had a couple of in 2020. So that's so important to ensure that we have an opportunity of representation across the different maps that we draw in the different districts that are going to be taking into account in our communities. And again, we do this by education to engage the general public, advocates and activists through our various channels, and how to impact the drawing of equitable maps through understanding the state and local political and demographic landscape, leveraging communities, partnerships, spaces, and approaches like communities of interest. We also do a lot of training to provide technical training on the use of tabular data and other data sets to assess and draw maps. This will be for a niche grounding, but understanding the range of tools and resources that are essential to empowering communities' engagement. Advocacy to continue to advocate for fair and inclusive maps, and the end of packing, cracking, and prison gerrymandering to lift up redistricting community engagement at the grassroots and grass-top level, and also litigation to intervene through the courts when and where necessary.
Thank you, Eduardo. And as we think about the notion of majority minority districts, if you will, and intentionally drawing districts that are racially equitable and inclusive, there's a couple of ways in which communities are doing it. There's the community mapping angle, but there's also an approach known as communities of interest. And so we want to walk, and this is a teaser because there's a deeper dive training that will go into communities of interest, but to point out that we are focusing in on ongoing efforts, which is really about independent redistricting based upon an approach known as communities of interest. And by definition, a community of interest is a neighborhood, community, or group of people who have a common policy concern and would benefit from being maintained in a single district. And their policy concern is not singular, it's plural, but it's the notion of making sure that there's some type of community cohesion thought through when drawing maps. Now, I found this cartoon to be eye-opening. I wouldn't call it funny, a little disturbing, but it shows how when someone can intentionally gerrymander a map, it literally can cut other folks out. And so, the notion is we don't want any community members to be left out of really being able to engage with the drawing of their map. And I literally keep going back to Martha and being a part of that Venn diagram. What does your map in terms of your political representation need to look like? What should it look like? And for a lot of state efforts, it's a focus at this point. It's currently lifted up in HR 1, the For the People Act legislation, and reflected in S1, which is the Senate companion legislation. And it really is a big step forward in addressing and preventing extreme, intentional minority vote dilution and helping to mobilize communities, bringing folks together to really wrestle with what does it mean to have a district drawn that reflects who we are, what we believe collectively, and how it reflects our vote choices, if you will, into the future. Now, I want to give a footnote that this approach is not a guaranteed fix for racial exclusion. And so when you think about the notion of geographic segregation, if you will, communities of color in many cases are still clustered in cities, in urban communities, if you will, while their white counterparts are more spread out in rural areas. And when you start to look at that, it means an approach centered on compact, really, compact community-based districts, if it does not take into account some form of the demographics of that community, and I'm using demographics broadly here, then it can produce unintentional racialized gerrymanders. And an example in Pennsylvania shows, even with using communities of interest and really stretching that notion, you could end up with a map that looks pretty much skewed towards, a non-inclusive and a non-equitable set of maps, if you will. And so the goal is to also make sure that we keep that at the forefront when we're thinking about the VRA, minority vote dilution, map drawing, and what it means to have an approach that is community of interest centered. And so at this point, we've been talking at you a lot about mapping. We hope folks are grounded in the baseline of the VRA and what it does as it relates to redistricting. But we have resources at www.redistrictingcommunitycollege.com. You're going to hear this over and over again, this website, you will see it. This is where these resources are housed.